Thank you very much, young Joshua. And we can tell that the Laborie constituency is in very, very good hands. Distinguished chairman of this St. Lucia Labour Party, the oldest mass political organization in St. Lucia, Comrade the Honorable Moses Musa Jabatis. Esteemed political leader and long-standing champion of the St. Lucian working people, Comrade Philip J. Pierre. Immediate past political leader who is so far, the most transformative Prime Minister in St. Lucia's post-colonial history, the very Honorable Comrade Dr. Kennedy Anthony. Members of our host constituency, the Laborie constituency group, and our parliamentary rep for Laborie and Auger, Comrade Alva Baptiste. Former party chairman, Claudius Francis. Devoted General Secretary of the Labour Party, Brother Leo Clark. Distinguished former Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Professor Von Lewis and Lady Lewis. Honorable members of the House of Assembly and members of the Senate, members of the Diplomatic Corps, all former members of Parliament, members of Cabinet, former candidates, and former officers of the St. Lucia Labour Party, all visiting delegates from overseas, fraternal parties and organizations, members of the Executive and National Council of the SLP, and most importantly, distinguished delegates of the 68th Annual Conference of the St. Lucia Labour Party, as well as members of the public, the media, well-wishers, citizens, patriots, friends, and comrades. Good afternoon. Let me, first of all, place on record my gratitude to the political leader, Comrade Philip Pierre, for the fraternal honor that he has bestowed upon me by inviting me to deliver this feature address at this important 68th Annual General Conference of the St. Lucia Labour Party. Mr. Political Leader, I am very pleased that you have given me an opportunity to share my perspective on the current moment in St. Lucia today, and I am sincerely humbled by the confidence that you have placed in me. I am also pleased that you have invited me here because I am very much looking forward to hearing your own address later this afternoon on how you plan to respond to the economic challenges of St. Lucia. Because as a student of politics of the Caribbean, I'm sure that you will offer some things to us, and I am very happy to learn, to listen to you and learn. Let me state for the record that I am not speaking here as an officer of the University of the West Indies. And whatever I have to say here today, I am not saying as a representative of the University of the West Indies. But I am speaking here in my own personal capacity as a concerned citizen of St. Lucia and as a card-carrying member of the St. Lucia Labour Party. I am not sure if my membership dues are up to date, but this is the open session, and it would have to be a very brave man who would try to take me away from the conference today. Let me also congratulate you, the members of the St. Lucia Labour Party, on the attainment of your 68th year as an annual conference. Your organization stands as the longest-serving mass organization that exists deliberately for representing the economic and political interests of the workers, the small farmers, the business people, the teachers, and civil servants of this country. In short, you are the oldest mass political organization of the working people of St. Lucia, and I think we should all clap for that. The fortunes of St. Lucia rise and fall with the fortunes of the St. Lucia Labour Party. The SLP under George Ethel Charles between the 1950s and early 1960s guided St. Lucia through the early days of transition from sugarcane to bananas. It ushered in the rise of the trade union movement, and it gave birth to modern parliamentary democracy in the form of universal adult suffrage and one man, one vote. What we take for granted today as modern parliamentary democracy was the work of the St. Lucia Labour Party between 1949 and the early 1960s. It was George Charles who began the process of providing secondary and junior secondary schools to St. Lucia, beyond the only two that were provided by the Roman Catholic Church, St. Mary's College and St. Joseph's Convent. It was George F.L. Charles and the SLP that built the Viewfort Secondary School to provide education to the children of the South. Between the 1960s and 1970s, it was the St. Lucia Labour Party which led the fight against the exploitation of the farmers by the multinational yeast industries. It was the SLP which led the demand for a fair price for the farmers, and it was the SLP which was the first to issue warnings against the degradation of the environment and the health risks to the farmers caused by the banana industry. It was the SLP which demanded that we send our children to school instead of sending them to head bananas on Wednesdays and Thursdays, the so-called banana days when the geese boat was in port. And in the 1960s and 1970s, it was the SLP which fought for gender justice and for women's rights, when it stood side by side with the St. Lucia Teachers Union, when unmarried pregnant teachers were being sent home for having children out of wedlock. And in the 1960s and 1970s, it was the SLP which stood side by side with the St. Lucia Civil Service Association to improve the wages and living conditions of government workers. In the decades of the 1960s and 1970s, some of St. Lucia's most able and respected statesmen and political leaders came out of the womb of the St. Lucia Labour Party. As we meet in our 68th annual conference, it is spiritually useful, and indeed it is pleasing in the eyes of God, if we honor our ancestors by remembering and calling out the names of those who have gone beyond and those who are still here. People like Alan Louisi, George Odlum, Hilford de Turville, Calix Judge, Tom Walcott, John Odlum, Cecil Lay, and Gregor Mason, who we are burying on Thursday. All came out of the womb of the St. Lucia Labour Party and made their contributions to national development and to the advancement of the people of St. Lucia. And it was the same thing in the decade of the 1980s to the early 1990s. In the 1980s, it was the St. Lucia Labour Party under the leadership of Julian R. Hunt, which began the process of transitioning St. Lucia out of the dying days of bananas and to prepare St. Lucia for a post-banana society and economy. Who can forget how the SLP, under the leadership of Brother Julian R. Hunt, formed an alliance with the Banana Salvation Committee to usher in the process of preparing St. Lucia for a world after yeast and a world after banana dependency. We should not forget, too, that it was the SLP under Julian R. Hunt that began the struggle to break the monopoly of cable and wireless and to demand the process of liberalization of telecommunications. Because a new world was emerging and a new society based on telecommunications and services was about to be born. It was the SLP which was the midwife which gave birth to the new St. Lucia out of the womb of the old. This, comrades, is the historical legacy of the St. Lucia Labour Party over its 68 years, and it is a history in which we are all justifiably proud. And who can forget our work in the decade of the late 1990s into the 2000s? After 3 decades of being in opposition and making our contribution to national development, it was no accident that the oldest and most experienced political organization in St. Lucia gave us the best government that St. Lucia has ever seen. The years 1997 to 2006 were indeed the years of St. Lucia's transformation from an agricultural economy into one based on tourism, services, financial services, telecommunications, and a knowledge economy. Under Kenny Anthony and the SLP, Schools were expanded and new primary and tertiary and secondary schools were built. Universal secondary education was introduced. Healthcare was modernized. The psychiatric and general hospitals were modernized and transformed. The Beausejour cricket ground was built. The George Odlum National Stadium appeared out of nowhere. The fisheries sector was modernized. The telecommunications sector was liberalized, and every household far in the country and deep in the town got access to telephones, electricity, television, and water, and I can go on and on and on and on. But I have said all of this to you, comrades, to make the point that as a political party, you have nothing of which to be ashamed. Your 68 years represent 68 years of accumulated wisdom and experience. 68 years of providing leadership to the people of St. Lucia. And 68 years of being at the forefront of development in St. Lucia. In those 68 years, we have enjoyed the wine of the victorious, and we have swallowed the bitter medicine of the vanquished. We have had successes and we have had setbacks. We have faced betrayals, but we have also benefited from true fraternal brotherhoods, permanent loyalties, and deep friendships. So our detractors should hear us loudly and clearly that we are not afraid of the future, since we are the best prepared party and the most able party to lead St. Lucia into its future. As it was then, so it is now. That is the eternal truth that I am calling on delegates to reflect upon as you mark your 68th annual conference. And in the midst of this reflection, we must pay special honor to the people of Laborie, the people of Beaufort North, and the people of Castries South for having always stood by the St. Lucia Labour Party through thick and thin. But comrades, despite our great history and our unmatched contribution to development, we find ourselves in opposition once again. Despite all the evidence of our ability to govern, despite all the proof of our genuine commitment to St. Lucia's development, despite the fact that we have consistently produced the best and most able leaders of St. Lucia, and despite the fact that we have always striven to maintain a record of uprightness and propriety in government, we find ourselves arrayed against class and social forces which consistently succeed in mobilizing enough public opinion against us to deny us our rightful place as the government of St. Lucia. Anyone who continues to doubt the quality and uprightness of the leadership of the St. Lucia Labour Party might want to reflect on what has been happening to other parties in the Caribbean that have recently found themselves in opposition. I am here from the island of Barbados, which just had a general election in May, which saw the defeat of the Democratic Labour Party, which had been in government for 2 terms since 2008. Less than 2 months after the change of government in Barbados, a former Minister of Commerce who was part of the last government was arrested in the USA on charges of money laundering and is now being tried in a US court. The same can be said of the UNC of Trinidad and Tobago with the Jack Warner FIFA scandal, with former Minister Warner now fighting extradition to a US court. All over the Caribbean and in St. Lucia itself, there have been credible reports of parliamentarians who have had their US visas revoked. All over the Caribbean, we are receiving reports of ministers being fired from the cabinets for reasons of corruption and impropriety. In St. Lucia, just a few months after the UWP was elected to office, a Minister of Agriculture from Dennery North, whose name no one cares to remember, was hastily dismissed from the cabinet, leaving all of us to speculate about the reasons. Less than 1 year after the UWP was elected to office, all the little sons and daughters of St. Lucia were seeing pictures on their cell phones of a minister in the Ministry of Finance, Eubaldas Raymond, with his red rooster in his hand, like a man going to a cockfight. Who can forget the last cabinet of John Compton and Stephenson King? who gave us a man convicted of grand theft auto in the USA as a candidate, and who gave us scandal after scandal, from Tuxedo Villas Gate to Taiwan Gate to Red Envelope Gate and Tom Chu Gate. It is a glowing statement on the quality and uprightness of the leadership of the St. Lucia Labour Party, that more than 2 years after losing the 2016 election, and after being in office from 1997 to 2006, there has not been one credible or real instance of one of its ministers being in trouble with global or local authorities for acts of corruption, and you have already clapped for that. And yet, despite being indeed the best and only party in the last 20 years, which has shown the ability and willingness to govern in the best interest of St. Lucia as a whole, we find ourselves in a situation where the best and most prepared group of men and women have been put out of office in exchange for the worst and least prepared group of men for public office since independence. We have lived to witness the best Prime Minister so far, Kennedy Anthony, being cast aside for an unknown quantity, a jab and sack, a political misfit, a give-me-a-try Prime Minister, someone socially and culturally alien to the soul of the people of St. Lucia, an opportunistic pretender, a tech flow, Alan Shastney. Of all the persons who have occupied the office of Prime Minister, Shastney is the least prepared for the job, and he's leading the least able group of men and women ever assembled as the cabinet of St. Lucia. Comrades, as we meet in this 68th annual conference, it is necessary that we do an analysis of the factors which account for the strange position in which St. Lucia finds itself. We must account for why such a political aberration called Alan Shastney was elected in place of a tried and proven government. What sins and offenses did we commit that so troubled the St. Lucian voter, that caused them to rejoice over our downfall and to celebrate this perfect stranger who they knew nothing about and who they are only now discovering? In keeping with your conference theme of Organize, Mobilise, and Consolidate, I want to crave your indulgence and to engage in a brief analysis of what factors might explain our defeat and why, despite our warnings, St. Lucians believed that they could place their trust in a group of men and women who had never given us any previous reason to believe that they were capable of governing, and who, as everyone can now see very clearly, absolutely cannot govern. Comrades, the election of Alan Shastney cannot be separated from the wider global ideology which have seen the attack on social democratic governments like the SLP. What we have seen in recent times is that governments which have always put people at the center of development, governments which have always insisted on the provision of social services like healthcare and education, are being attacked by a new ideology which says that poor people should be allowed to fend for themselves, and too bad for those who cannot afford to pay. This ideology is called the ideology of neoliberalism. This new ideology has been very hostile to governments providing education, healthcare, subsidized public transport, and other social services for those who cannot pay for themselves. It is an anti-people ideology, and it is a pro-business ideology. It is this new ideology which has pushed the idea of privatization. That is, that states and governments will withdraw from certain economic activities and allow those activities to be taken over by the private sector. Once people begin to accept the idea of privatization as gospel truth, they begin to believe that government is a business and that governments exist only for the expansion of private business. One step away from this view is the biggest lie of all, that businessmen make the best political rulers and that the Prime Minister should be a businessman. Comrades, the same historical forces that explain Donald Trump in the USA explain Alan Chastney in St. Lucia. All the myths were the same. Trump claimed that he was a successful businessman and he would make America rich and great again. Chastney claimed that he was a businessman and he would put ching-ching in St. Lucia's pockets. On my way here, I met an old lady who said, the rumble in her belly is so loud that she cannot hear the sound of the ching-ching in her pocket. Budai café mal telma, budai café si telma de zod, il pas même temps son ching-ching na pochli. Chastney even promised that he would get America to remove visa restrictions on St. Lucia. Big lie after big lie after big lie. But the people of St. Lucia were drinking it up. Just as Trump in the USA was treating politics like the making of business deals, our own tropical Trump in St. Lucia, Alan Chastney, was busy going from constituency to constituency, treating the selection of candidates like the making of business deals. All kinds of people were promised all kinds of things. People who were 50 and 40 years old, who for all their lives never once expressed a public view or a political view about anything. People who never held a political opinion publicly were being called in the middle of the night and convinced that they should become politicians and public figures. People who could not even spell the word honorable member were getting excited by the promise that they could be parliamentarians. You should have heard some of them. Hey boy, you heard Chastney call me? Chastney called me. He wants me to run for him. Chastney said he heard I was popular in the village. Boasting about a call from Chastney as if a call from Chastney is a mark of distinction. Now some of them who run for Chastney are busy regretting. They waited until after they entered politics to discover what politics is really about. Now any chance they get, and to anyone willing to listen, they are now saying that they are not politicians. My advice to you, conference, is not to drink that Kool-Aid. Not this 68-year-old institution will drink that Kool-Aid from no Johnny-come-lately. Let them pay the price for their political opportunism. They are only saying that they are not politicians in order to come across like little innocents who did not know what they were doing in the hope that we would feel sorry for them. They want to come across like victims when they are the ultimate victimizers. They want you to believe that although they went to bed with Chastney, they are still the same nice guys that we always knew. And they want you to ignore the fact that it is their vote in Parliament and in the Cabinet that is helping Chastney perpetuate his inexperienced and reckless leadership. To those members of the UWP who are in bed with Chastney and want to pretend that they are both in and out at the same time by saying that they are not politicians, this 68th annual conference says the following. Anyone who offers himself for public office is a politician. We are saying that if you are unhappy with Chastney, support Philip J. Pierre's vote of no confidence and vote against Chastney in the Parliament. But do not do like Pontius Pilate by washing your hand of responsibility while you are continuing to help Chastney crucify the people of St. Lucia. By the way, the SLP never has to call strangers in the middle of the night to run as candidates. The SLP never has to approach people who have had no record of public service to convince them that they can be politicians. The SLP does not invent candidates. The public records and past achievements of the SLP candidates speak for themselves. Our candidates are not discovered, they only emerge. Long before he was a politician, everyone knew Musa as the culture man, the taboo Mele man, the community leader, the school teacher and school principal. Nobody had to find Musa under a rock. Long before Organise became a politician, everyone knew him as a national debater, as the General Secretary of the National Youth Council, as a youth leader, as a man who had distinguished himself at the University of the West Indies, the University of Cambridge, and the London School of Economics. He was well known throughout the region as the CEO of the West Indies Cricket Board, we did not have to search for Comrade Ernest under a log. Brother Sean Edwards was a community leader, a regional sports person, a Windward Islands cricketer, a Windward Islands under-19 cricket manager long before he became candidate for the St. Lucia Labour Party. And long before Brother Alva became a politician, he was well known throughout the country as a national debater from high school, a community organizer in Laborie, as a member of the National Youth Council, and as an active trade unionist in the CSA representing the interests of air traffic controllers. We did not have to find Comrade Alva under a mattress. And we did not have to find Philip J. Pierre under a stone. Along with Stephenson King and Kenny Anthony, he is among the longest-serving members of the House of Assembly. And he is one of the most experienced public figures in St. Lucia today. He has given decades of service to Castries East. He has given decades of service to the St. Lucia Labour Party. He has given decades of service to the business community of St. Lucia. And he has given decades of service to the government and people of St. Lucia. That is why we did not have to discover him as our political leader. He simply emerged. But my friends, we should not be surprised by any of this, and we should not have been surprised by the rise of Chastney. One of the new claims of the new ideology of neoliberalism was that people who had been in government for too long, the so-called insiders, needed to be replaced by people who are strangers to government, the so-called outsiders. Again, that was the same message we heard in the USA with Donald Trump, and it was the same message which we heard with our own tropical Trump, Alan Chastney in St. Lucia. So in the USA, there was a claim that the political insiders like the Clintons were the cause of all the problems of the country, and the world was fed on the false idea that because Trump was an outsider, he would come in and drain the swamp. For the first time in the history of politics, we were being asked to believe that lack of political experience is the best qualification for political leadership. And it was the same thing with Chastney in St. Lucia. All the opportunistic regional and local commentators and the so-called pollsters and consultants, the political prostitutes who were being paid to sing for their supper and who had a vested interest in seeing Chastney emerge, came to St. Lucia to peddle their own version of the story that people with political experience should be replaced by people with no political experience. One of the things we heard them saying in St. Lucia is that anyone can be a prime minister. Another thing which they did was finding no fault in Kenny Anthony. They began to peddle the nonsensical view that Kenny was past his sell-by date. That could only emerge from the mind of a regional opportunist who could find no case against Kenny Anthony and the SLP. Our prime minister is not a tin of corned beef with an expiry date on his back. How do you measure when a man has expired? I would have had no problem if they told us which policies had failed and which specific actions by the government they disagreed with. But being the trained opportunists and political jammets that they are, and finding no fault in Kenny, they had to invent their own criteria and their own standard of measurement, and they appointed themselves as the sole judge and announced to us as if they were little gods from heaven above that the prime minister had gone past his sell-by date. Comrades, all of these claims were just opportunistic noises to allow Chastney, someone who was totally outside the political system, to get an easy entry into the office of the prime minister. They would not want Chastney in their cabinet in Barbados. The people of Jamaica would never elect Chastney as prime minister, but all kinds of people from Barbados and Jamaica were in St. Lucia trying to sell Chastney to us. But when we analyze the 2016 election, we should also do a class analysis. Despite the fact that Chastney had no social connection to the ordinary St. Lucian people, there were specific class interests that stood to gain from his election. That is why we saw all of these regional business interests and all of the politicians from the right-wing political parties in Jamaica and the Caribbean coming to tell us that Chasney was good for us. In the UWP manifesto itself, Chasney was telling us that all his past associations had been with regional business interests. We were left to infer that since he was an employee of those regional business interests, and since those regional interests control large sections of the St. Lucian economy, they would be in a wonderful position if their former employee became the Prime Minister. So now we have a unique situation of having two cabinet members who are former employees of a business owner and a business which is dominating the tourism sector. I am always guided by the biblical principle that a man cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and Mammon. You cannot be a servant of St. Lucia and a servant of Sandals at the same time. That is why when Gaston Brown of Antigua had a quarrel with Sandals in Antigua, Alan Chasney felt compelled to put his nose in that quarrel and to put his mouth in Gaston Brown's business, although Gaston Brown is the legitimate Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. That is why we see decisions to write off 20 million in taxes owed by Sandals. That is why when we see decisions to write off 20 million in taxes owed by Sandals, we have a legitimate right to demand transparency in how the decision was arrived at. I am not casting aspersions on anyone. I am not accusing anyone of illegality. I am merely talking about a relationship of power. As we develop our democracy, we should also develop practices of transparency. Since two members of the cabinet are former employees of Butch Stewart, in the interest of transparency and good government, there is indeed an urgent need to make public the opinion of the Inland Revenue Department to the cabinet on the question of taxes owed by Sandals. It is in the interest of the UWP to do so in order to provide clarity to other hoteliers and business establishments who might want a similar facility extended to them in the future. I want to recommend to the conference that in your closed session, when you are tabling resolutions, that one of the constituencies moves a resolution supporting the cause of our political leader, Philip J. Pierre, and of the former Prime Minister, Kennedy Anthony, for the government to make public the opinion of the Inland Revenue Department on the taxes owed by the state by Sandals. You know, dear comrades, when we make those kind of statements, and when we take those kind of stances, our detractors like to accuse us of being anti-business. The Labour boys don't understand business. That's what they say in private. The Labour boys don't know anything about business. When they say that we don't know anything about business, they are forgetting that Julian R. Hunt, one of the long-standing leaders of the St. Lucia Labour Party, was a businessman. They say that, forgetting too, that Philip J. Pierre is a businessman, an accountant, and business accountant, and business consultant who has worked for and with the business sector all his life. The difference between Julian R. Hunt and Chasney is that they have never said to the people, vote for me because I am a businessman, or vote for me because all my friends and past associations are with businessmen and business interests. Julian R. Hunt and Philip J. Pierre have always said, vote for me because we have experience in government and public life. Vote for me because we care for poor people and we will work in the interest of St. Lucia as a whole. They have never said that politics is like a business. But comrades, since we are doing a class analysis of why we lost the last election, we must also explain the political behavior of the local petty bourgeoisie. In particular, we must explain why the upper and middle sections of the civil service were so eager to exchange a government that was known for its technical competence and one that had managed to avoid the stench of corruption for a bunch of untested persons unfamiliar with the rudiments of government. We must explain why the educated sections of the St. Lucian middle class and why the technical people in the civil service and the lawyers and the teachers were so eager to entrust government in the hands of the UWP, especially since they had shown such a poor performance record when they were in government between 2006 and 2011, when they had lurched from crisis to crisis and from scandal to scandal. At the very least, we expect our teachers and civil servants to applaud and reward technical competence. And we should always expect the thinking sections of the middle class to be supportive of corruption-free government. Otherwise, what kind of example are we setting for our children? But comrades, we must do a proper class analysis. And in doing so, we must always remember that among the psychological traits of the petty bourgeoisie are the traits of opportunism, petty jealousy, self-interest and material greed, and a desire for upward social mobility. Too often, our friends in the public service are motivated by the desire for a small promotion here and a small promotion there. There would be many in the civil service who would have felt themselves slighted by our party and would have invested in the other party only as a route to self-promotion. The middle class and petty bourgeoisie is often driven by professional envy. They would look at our cabinet members and say, Masa, where Kenny? Masa, where Alva? They would see our soldiers like Brother Dr. Ernest Hilaire, Brother Philip J. Pierre, and Brother Musa. And instead of celebrating them as hard-working St. Lucians who have been able to pursue an education and who have risen to become leaders in their respective professions, instead of applauding these achievements, a deep professional envy takes hold of the petty bourgeoisie. We should never rule out the way these psychological traits can determine how sections of the middle class may vote in an election. When you meet some teachers and civil servants and point out to them that being a bus driver is not an adequate preparation for the job of Minister of Economic Development, they respond by telling you, ma foot melee. When you tell them that there are special and unique standards for choosing people to high public office, they respond with ma foot melee. My friends, I have traveled all over the Caribbean, and St. Lucia is the only place where the educated sections of the population have developed this philosophy of ma foot melee. It is only the ideology of ma foot melee that can explain why, in a country that has produced 2 Nobel laureates, that you can have so many people in the wrong position and so many people who cannot stay in their section. Comrades, as we enter a new phase in our political struggle, we need to develop an appropriate strategy for approaching the volatile middle class. I'm not talking here about the 35 to 40% that always votes for one party because of reasons of family history and reasons of political socialization. I'm talking here about the class of people who present themselves as the thinking voter, the floating voter. Those who claim they vote on issues, not party. We must at all times place what is best for St. Lucia squarely before their eyes. Because as educated St. Lucians deep down inside, they care about the direction in which St. Lucia is heading. We must work very hard with the more progressive ones to overcome this dangerous philosophy of ma foot melee. At the same time, we should not be afraid to expose, isolate, and reject the backward ones who are motivated only by professional envy and self-interest, and who prefer to cut off their noses to spite their faces. And finally, comrades, in our analysis of the 2016 election, we should not rule out the machinations of Cambridge Analytica, which our comrades from the one party told us about. The name of St. Lucia has come up too often in too many international reports and in too many of the official global investigations into the work of Cambridge Analytica and the Facebook scandal for us to ignore the extent to which fake news and opinion manipulation turned reasonable people against a reasonable government. The Cambridge Analytica people have boasted that they would package candidates with no talent and make them look like they had something to offer. The Cambridge Analytica people boasted that they would write speeches for so-called politicians and instruct them to read every line like robots, knowing deep down inside that left to themselves, the politicians who they were packaging lacked any real substance. The special committee of the British Parliament, which was investigating the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and which heard the testimony of the whistleblower Christopher Wiley, heard that the business model of Cambridge Analytica was, and I quote, based on the capture of governments in countries with weak civic institutions and the selling of influence to companies wishing to establish businesses in the captured states. Doesn't that sound everything like what is happening in St. Lucia today? When you see a government forcing business projects down the throats of the people, despite all the warnings from the technical people, and despite all the public demonstrations against it, you are seeing signs of state capture, and you must look for the hand of Cambridge Analytica. When you saw such a fuss that would be made, all the social media coverage and buzz that took place just because Chasney went into KFC, as if Christ had returned to earth, you have to look for the hand of Cambridge Analytica. By the way, since when is a St. Lucian, an ordinary human being, going into KFC a big news item? The only reason why a being going into KFC is big news is if that being was an alien. Chasney is such an alien that him going into KFC was big news. When you see the way people hated Kelly Anthony with so much venom, and they could not tell you why, when you began to hear doubts being planted about our leader Philippe J. Pierre, when you see the way deliberately false articles began appearing on internet blog sites, written by persons with no previous interest in St. Lucia, you cannot rule out the hand of Cambridge Analytica. And finally, when you saw the emptiness of the UWP election message, an election slogan of 5 to stay alive, that said nothing, meant nothing, signified nothing, but people were running behind it like it was manna falling from heaven, you cannot rule out the hand of Cambridge Analytica. It is in this context today, conference, that we now have the case of the Emperor's New Clothes in St. Lucia. You all remember the primary school story of the Emperor's New Clothes? Yes. Well, we have our own version of the Emperor's New Clothes in St. Lucia. Everybody was packaging Chasney, telling us that he was wearing French clothes, that his clothes were made by the best tailors in the land, that he's wearing the finest silk. In Deviso, they even dressed him like a king and wrapped him in a yellow robe like a pope. They told us that he had a Midas touch, that he was a businessman and everything he touched would turn to gold, that he would reduce the price of gas on the global market, that he would end visa requirements for travel to the USA, he would end poverty in St. Lucia, and that the economy would grow by 3% every year. They wanted us to believe that Emperor Chasney was wearing some very fine clothes indeed. So where are we today? It did not take St. Lucia long. It did not take St. Lucia long to see that the emperor was naked. That when you open him up, there was nothing inside. All you find inside the package was useless fluff, stuffing and cotton, and some styrofoam. It did not take St. Lucia long to see that Emperor Chasney was a purport bouet. And now the regional consultants are gone. The Cambridge analytical people are gone. And the St. Lucian people are now left holding the purport bouet. And so we all felt the embarrassment when he could not read the standing orders on the first working day of Parliament, and all St. Lucians held their heads down in shame. And yet, despite not being able to read, he's bold enough to say that 45% of the St. Lucian people have a preschool level of education. I hope he included himself in that 45%. Imagine too, he was the same person who put a freeze on teachers being trained at the St. Lucia Teachers College because he said we had enough trained teachers in St. Lucia. So you see the irony? He's saying that 45% of St. Lucians have a preschool level of education, but there are enough trained teachers in St. Lucia, and that is coming from a prime minister whose reading level is like that of a preschooler. And we all felt the embarrassment too when he was being interviewed by the Nation newspaper in Barbados, and he began to give some high numbers of St. Lucians deported by the US government, and the American embassy in Barbados had to issue an early statement correcting all his mistakes, and St. Lucians' heads went down in shame because they were all seeing now that the emperor is naked. And how we felt the embarrassment when he went to the Kentucky Derby and he was introduced as the employee of a Chinese racehorse company and not the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, and all our heads went down in shame because the emperor was naked. We have felt the embarrassment of the Desert Star Holding fiasco, with the Prime Minister agreeing to virtually give the whole of Beaufort away because he does not understand that running a country is not like running a private business, and because he has no historical connection to the suffering of the St. Lucian people, he does not understand that St. Lucians are not willing to give up their patrimony for the sake of what he thinks is economic development. We are now seeing the fiasco over the St. Jude Hospital and the Owen King Hospital, and we are all feeling the embarrassment. Again, because he thinks only in terms of private sector-led development, he cannot understand the issue of public access to proper health care. He sees all the institutions that the SLP built, our modernized health institutions in the north, and he can only think of how valuable they would be to private sector interests. He cannot think of health care as making health services accessible to the poor people of the country. And we have seen the fiasco with the closing down of the marketing board, Radio St. Lucia, and his proposed privatization of the government printry. Again, because he can only think in terms of private sector interests, he cannot understand the concept of a public good. He doesn't understand that a state needs to own a radio station because it has a duty to provide information to its public as a public good, and you cannot risk transferring that responsibility to the private sector, which are interested only in profit. What will happen in a major national emergency and the private sector-owned station has no obligation to do any broadcasting on behalf of the public? And finally, we are all feeling the embarrassment of his style of governance and his massa behavior. Because he is a package entity with no social connection to the people of St. Lucia, and because he is trying to run the government in the same way he would run a private business, he has shown no tolerance for democratic discussion and the normal give and take. When the Civil Service Association writes to ask for dialogue on the future of the Customs Department, Emperor Chasney writes back to say that the CSA cannot make policy for him. When the St. Lucia National Trust expresses its concern about the proposed Dolphin Park and about the Desert Star Holdings development in Beaufort, Emperor Chasney withholds the subvention from them and asks for the dismissal of the director. When the St. Lucia Medical Association requests information and dialogue about the future of the St. Jude's Hospital and expresses concerns about the conditions at the Judge Odlum Stadium, Emperor Chasney treats them as if they are enemies of the state. When the journalists do the same job that they were always doing when the SLP was in power, they are told to shut up. And when the Calypsonians perform in the same way that they have always performed, the emperor uses his platforms to condemn them for singing what they always sing. The naked emperor is busy destroying all the institutions that it took successive governments to build over several decades. He could not construct the Owen King Hospital. He could not create the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. He could not develop Radio St. Lucia, but he has come on the scene in all his nakedness and is busy trying to give away things that he could never have built for himself to lucky investors and the private sector. On observing Emperor Chasney in action, we are forced to recall the lyrics of Bob Marley's Crazy Ballhead. Didn't my people before me slave for this country? Now you look me with that scorn, and you eat up all my corn. Didn't my people before me build Radio St. Lucia? Didn't Comrade Oliver Lawrence help build Radio St. Lucia? Didn't my people build the St. Louis Community College? Didn't Hunter François and Von Louis and Lusca Theophilus and James Paulette Louisi help build the St. Lucia, the St. Louis Community College? Yes. Didn't my people before me build the National Printery? Didn't my people before me build the Customs Department? Yes. Didn't my people before me build the Boseju Cricket Ground? Yes. Didn't Mario Michel, Ernest Hilaire, and Armstrong Alexis build the Boseju Cricket Ground? Yes. Didn't my people before me build the St. Lucia Marketing Board? Yes. Didn't my people before me build the Judge Odlum National Stadium? Yes. Didn't Judge Odlum and my good friend Peter Lansico, through his negotiations with the Chinese, as a technocrat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, help build the Judge Odlum Stadium? Yes. Didn't my people before me build the Owen King Hospital and the St. Jude's Hospital? Yes. Now you look me with that scorn. You look me with that scorn and say that all I have is the preschool level of education, and you eat up all my corn. And so, my brothers, we have come to the point when we no longer have to warn anyone about Shastni. The emperor is now naked, and all St. Lucians can now see for themselves. The march of 10,000 St. Lucians of all stripes and shades in September was the proof that the people's eyes are now opened, and the people are disappointed, and they cannot take it anymore. This is why in this conference, we should also move a resolution supporting the call by our political leader for a vote of no confidence in Prime Minister Alan Shastri. This is why, too, we have to support the call of the political leader for us to organize, mobilize, and consolidate. We cannot take the march of 10,000 people in September for granted. The powerful business interests are waiting to do their thing again. Cambridge Analytica is wounded but not dead. The petty bourgeois opportunists are still busy peddling the negative propaganda against Philippe J. Pierre. The Kenny haters are still alive and well. The ideology of Mahfoud Mele is still going strong. In the next few months, we have only one duty. We need to stay focused and to work for one thing only: the restoration of the St. Lucia Labour Party back to its rightful place as the rightful government of St. Lucia. In this task, there is no room for vacillation, and there is no room for division and backbiting. We have to rally around the leadership of Philippe J. Pierre. Pay no attention to the opportunists, many of whom owe the evolution and the elevation to their work within the St. Lucia Labour Party. Pay no attention to those who are sowing doubts about the readiness of PIP to lead St. Lucia forward. Philippe J. Pierre emerged as the leader of the SLP, not as a special favor from anyone, but on the basis that he's a tried, true, tested, and proven public figure. He is a statesman of deep experience, both in government and in opposition. He stands ready to take the mantle of leadership of this country and to rescue us from the mess that the current government has placed us in. Comrades, I want to close by offering some advice on the experience I just witnessed in May in Barbados. Like us here in St. Lucia, they were faced with a government that was an embarrassment to the proud people of Barbados. In order to remove that government from office, the opposition leader Maya Motley began a process of dialogue with all sectors of the population over a 3-year period. She called it rubbing shoulders. I want to propose that our leadership begins a process of meeting every sector of the society in deep dialogue to ascertain their needs, to hear how they feel, and to carve our policy response to the Shastni administration. In Barbados on election day, the people came out with one voice. They were determined to send a message that never again will such poor governance be allowed to take root in the country. So clear was their message that the new government won all 30 seats in the Barbadian parliament because they did not want to leave any doubt about how they felt and how disappointed they were in the last government. I want to propose that St. Lucia follows the Barbados example. In the next election, you have to send a clear message. Don't take any half measures. Don't leave no prisoners. Send a message to Chasney that never again will such a hoax be allowed to impose itself on the body politic of St. Lucia. Do like Barbados and vote all 17 seats for the St. Lucia Labour Party. I have every confidence that the people of St. Lucia are more aware now than they were 2 years ago. I have every confidence that the St. Lucia Labour Party is more aware of what it is up against now than it was 2 years ago. And I have every confidence that under the leadership of Philippe Pierre, guided by all the past leaders of this great party, and with the full support of the active and conscious base of the members of the party and the workers of this country, that we will soon meet at the rendezvous of victory, and we will relegate Alan Chasney, the alien Popot Boué, to the dustbin of history where he belongs. Forward ever! Forward ever! Forward ever! Long live the St. Lucia Labour Party! Long live the political leader Philippe J. Pierre! God bless the people of St. Lucia!